With me today, I have two special guests from my CTO forum group that I meet with on a monthly basis. Two amazing tech leaders in the Boston area, John and Neil. Why don't you guys give it just like a quick introduction to yourself?
Hi, I'm Neil Karasic. I am currently the VP of Product Management at Labviva, a Series B startup in the Boston area.
Hey everyone, I'm John Zablocki. Most people know me as JZ. I'm the VP of Technology at Embark Vet here in Boston.
Yeah, so the agenda for today is pretty straightforward. I kind of roped both of these guys in, and I've been doing a lot of work recently on foundational pieces that I wanted to try to get some feedback. The basic idea or the concept at a high level is that I think everybody kind of sees on an individual basis, especially power users, people that, like, I know both of you guys, that there's a lot of like really amazing things that can be done. But the thing that's a struggle is how to get the AI tools adopted in the most optimal way at an organizational level. The way I think about it, which actually this comes from an Anthropic talk that I watched a couple weeks ago, is this sort of layered number of circles where at the center is the actual model itself. The sort of layer on top of it is the agentic layer that each of these companies are creating that makes it even more powerful. So Claude Code, Gemini CLI, Codex, etc. But I think the thing that's sort of not as focused on or not as thought in a more systematic way is this sort of layer on top of the agentic layer provided by these frontier companies, Anthropic and everybody else, where you're putting like your proprietary knowledge. I mean, really what you want in an ideal case is that, you know, engineer, that the best engineer in your organization who's been there for like 20 years and knows everything, like getting their brain codified in a way that it's everybody who's using AI is also using that developer's brain or whatever. All of your organizational knowledge is kind of baked into AI as well. And so that's what's part of this context shell. There's different ways you could do this. In the extremes, like on the left side is, there's definitely a lot of approaches. Like I would say like the Claude bot, OpenClaw type stuff is more like what I view as the sort of chaotic approach, which is, you know, you give your agent that you're using the ability to have some sort of memory and to improve in theory or whatever, but you're not really actually focusing on how it's doing that. You're not focusing on the way that the different artifacts are organized. You're sort of like letting it organize itself. And, you know, it does get better in some sense, but it's sort of like a black box to you. Whereas on the other extreme is that you treat the artifacts that are part of whichever model you're using. So for Claude Code, it would be like the Claude Code skills and agent markdown files and all that type of stuff. You treat it as if it's your code, like as you focus on making sure that it's organized in the right way and structured in the way that humans like you and I can understand it. So it's not a black box. Like you actually do take special care. And in that way, like you sort of understand a little bit of what, it's not as much of a black box, what the AI is thinking about. You kind of understand where it's coming from and you're able to help improve it in whatever. There's 5 different pieces that align with the different types of artifacts that you can have with most of the different models these days. So with skills, like these are the core of everything. This is where you're putting all of your domain knowledge. And there's different types of skills. Like you actually should explicitly organize it in a way where you have kind of more lower level foundational stuff that's maybe not as proprietary or more just like the format of your Git commits or whatever. As a the higher level skills that use a lot of the other skills is, work like something like a workflow. So like the way that you do pull requests or that whole process of your developer workflow.
Where do things like, front end component libraries or, where do you see those falling?
think that it makes the most sense to minimize what's in your like main context file, like at the highest level. Like so for Claude, it's like the Claude MD file that has that's loaded in every single session that you have. Like it should be like super, super minimal. And for each of so everything else should be pushed down. Most of it should be pushed down to skills. And for the skills, in your description, you're identifying, the conditions under which that whole context is pulled in. So like there's some skills where it's like only if you're looking at this part of the code base, or only if this. But then for what you're talking about is a more general one. You can put in the description so that Claude knows to pull it in every single time that you're trying to like write any like Angular. Like I do this for Angular. Like for Angular, I have like anytime because we use Angular in a couple different places and we have best practices. And so it's like anytime that you run Angular code, you pull in this skill on a per skill basis. I view it as like a collaborative thing with the AI tool that I'm like, I dump it like my information. So for example, for like one part of my code base, I'm like, okay, this is how it works. Everything for my brain, like brain dump. And by the way, also in addition to my brain dump, do your own kind of research, look through my code base and like see what you can kind of figure out on your own. And then let's talk about it. And then like I usually like do a back and forth where I'm like, ask me questions. And then like I'm like, okay, I'm gonna quiz you, like keep going back and forth until it's like really refined. And then even then, as I go on for number 2 there, like anytime that it doesn't work as I expect. So like if I'm working with Claude Code on a particular part of my code base and it is using that skill, but it misunderstood one thing, and then whenever anything that happened, I'm like, okay, this is what it's supposed to be, and make sure you update that skill. So like there's a continuous process, iterative process of continuing to update those different pieces of knowledge within your that's checked into your repo, used by all the rest of your team, et cetera. So like as the team continues to use it, it keeps getting better and better. And the last thing, the generating code thing on the skill level, the markdown files are just words. It's like non-deterministic part. Even in the best cases, like sometimes the AI models don't use it in the right way. What helps a little bit is if you have something like deployments, like obviously you could script out everything for deployments, like make it all code. But for some parses of the way we do things, it's actually like there is a little bit of decision making that goes on in terms of like rollbacks and like whatever else. And so it's a mix of human in the current process, like non-AI current process. Like for us, it's like some human decision making and running some scripts or whatever. And so like I'll often, we'll have our skill in Claude Code for doing deployments that tries to codify what's in my brain for like the human decision making we do. But I'll tell it like, okay, if you can generate any code to help you do this like more efficiently, do that. And so within your skills, sometimes like the skill will have its own like little code scripts that can help make it run faster and more deterministic.
I'm curious, Jeff, as you work to create these skills, to create these knowledge bases, are you working with product to create that deep library of like what the app should do? Like how much of this is cross-functional?
Yeah, it's a good question because we actually it started off with us just having developers doing it just for coding, but we just started having this past week, I pushed some of our non-developer to start using it like for skills, like at the workflow level. Even for product managers, they have their own workflows. Like they might not be writing code, that might not be part of their responsibilities, but they also have like they track typical Scrum stuff for backlogs and planning out how work activities, what the priorities are and strategies. We want to track everything that happens. So when somebody is making a change, something that essentially gets put into a pull request eventually and then merged in and deployed, that there's a document created for that tracks everything. And, in the past, for us at least, we did have some levels of documentation for that. We had different systems for this or whatever. And so there is like if you use different Scrum tools or whatever, like maybe you are doing part of this, but I found this like really useful. Like AI does a really good job of tracking, the minute details of, the actual planning process, what happens during testing, all through deployment. So like even in the few weeks that we've been using this, I've heavily relied on the artifacts that are created, for any of these activities. And then, so for subagents, the way we use it is maybe different than other people, but like the way I view this is like subagents are like a runtime optimization that everything, the actual core knowledge is pushed down to skills. And so subagents is more about managing context. So like I know, I'm pretty sure you guys, we've talked about this level of stuff before, but you guys understand of like the difficulties of like the context window. So like both when you hit your limit, but even if you don't hit the limit and run out of context, the bigger it gets, the less quality you're going to get, right? I mean, so like it's helpful to create ways of making sure that your context window stays clean. And so subagents is like a really good way to do that. So one good example for this that we use is when we're doing, I have an example at the very end I'm going to show you guys when we're looking at bugs in the system. And for like one thing, just as an example, when we have an issue with our telephony system, we have to look through these huge log files for our Dractio and FreeSwitch servers. And just looking through those logs, like fill up the context window super quick, right? So instead of doing that in just like one thread with the one main agent, we have what we call the chief of staff, which is just an orchestrator, spin up 8 different support engineer agents. Each one looks at a different server, like individual server, just looking through the logs to find the right thing, and then they combine them all together. And so it's much faster, much more efficient. And then the kind of chief of staff, the context window for the chief of staff remains really tight and clean, and it just gets like the learnings from each of them, and then kind of like is able to hone in on what, and then pass that off to another agent to look into the actual code itself. Like, okay, here's the specific errors. Now it has reduced down to just like these couple lines. Now go into the code base and figure out why this might have happened or whatever. For custom commands, like actually Anthropic changed some of this recently. They've sort of pushed people to like merge some of the concept of commands and skills so that you can actually have a callable skill. So like technically you can do a / whatever and call the skill directly, which is somewhat the same thing, but just conceptually, with the way I like to think about it is that I don't have any of my skills as directly callable, and I have it like, I like to keep them separate, like custom commands, because like I feel like that's more like user interface. So it's much more about like simplifying how users use the most common things that we do. So I have a couple examples on the left side here. One of them I just mentioned, like for a bug. And so like we have it, you could basically paste almost anything, like a bug, you could do /bug and a URL or like a stack trace or whatever else. And we have everything set up that it knows how to then from there connect to the right system, find what the issue is, and then give you what it thinks the root cause and fix is. And then deployments, research. Actually, the research thing, one of our non-technical guys has like gone crazy with this the past week because we have this hooked up to Google Analytics, and our Search Console and SEMRush, and like a bunch of whole systems, like for our like through APIs with, or in some cases, if they have an MCP server, we use that. But it basically, whatever question you ask, it uses all those different connections to like do like a really good, it's like doing a deep research document with access to all of your internal stuff. Typically the answer for making sure that auditing, and if you need any like gatekeeper type, security checkpoints and whatever. That's what usually you use hooks for, that for the different parts of the life cycle of Claude Code or whatever else, you can hook into that and have some deterministic code that always will log in a certain area, or always will validate that you're not putting private information in, or whatever else it happens to be.
Where would you draw the line between doing it that way and just having something run in your deployment pipeline, for example?
Yeah, I mean, if you are already calling scripts or like having it automated in a programmatic way, you could just keep it doing that. Like the thing that I think makes sense for using hooks is if and when you do have certain processes that you are kind of handing off to AI to be like the brains that runs it, which isn't necessarily everything. And maybe that's not even a good idea for certain things that like do have a lot of compliance security requirements.
I mean, I'm impressed with how structured you've gotten in your journey here. I think we're earlier in the process on our side. And I think some of that is, as you can imagine, a bioinformatics pipeline that figures out a dog's ancestry is very different than building a web app. And so some of our code lends itself really easily to skills, where some of it is really complex science. Basically, Jupyter notebooks that become production systems are much harder to codify than some of our web standards and things. So certainly inspired by some of the stuff you showed to go a little deeper and see what we can do.
In earlier versions of what I was doing, my Claude MD has been huge and small and big again. But I do think it makes a lot of sense to keep this really, really small and tight. I do organize all of my skills into categories. So I kind of prefix them with the category name. Claude doesn't need this, or any agent that you use doesn't need it to be set up like this in such a structured way. So it's more for us as humans. And the important thing, and I've noticed this just even in the short time I've been starting to use this, is that by having it set up in this way, I am able to help the agent more learn and grow. Like there'll be times where it makes some sort of mistake, and because I've put some time into structuring this, I'm like, oh, I know why it is. It's because of this, or it's because of that. And it gives me the ability to like keep on refactoring some of these skills in a much more efficient way, because I know that like what each part does basically. So for the different types of skills, I mentioned I showed that sort of pyramid thing of like there's sort of more like lower level skills, like the Git skills, and the higher level skills. But just to give like one sense of idea, so like for like a service client skill, like these are all ones that in my mind wrap an external service. So they're all kind of connectivity to these other things like out there to get information or sometimes to do stuff, but mostly getting information. So yeah, Google Analytics, Google AdSense for us, our SEO tool, like, everything. So this gives it like a ton of power for like pulling in information. And so most of the time an API, but sometimes an MCP, sometimes the CLI.
Is your structure here, Jeff, is this assuming you have a mono repo, or are you storing the skills as a separate repo and then bringing them in?
That is a really good question. So ours is a mono repo, and it is a challenge when you don't have a mono repo, because you need to have an efficient way of like sharing it among all of your stuff. There's not currently a great way. Like you can treat it like code and just share it that way. And that's probably what most people have been doing. But like sharing skills, especially like when you're using like public skills that you share. I mean, it's one thing in sharing internally to your different projects. Like you could probably figure out that and do it just like you do with code. But I don't think it's been thought out enough. And then, yeah, I mentioned like the code ones. So like you could see here on the left side, for like each part of my code base, like there's like a GH web is like a certain part of the code base, legacy web, like an NG1. These are all like different parts of the code base. And like, if I open it up just for a second, you could see that it in the description, which is like this, when skills are loaded into memory, like the full context file isn't loaded initially when Claude Code starts up. It's just the description it is. And then if with whatever activity you're doing in your agent, your coding agent, it sees something that matches, then it'll pull in the full context. So like you want to make sure that whatever's in the description is the thing that Claude Code in this case is looking for to bring in the full context. So I make sure that it has like the directory name, like anything in this directory, or like any like keywords or whatever I want it to key off of when the user either types it in or it's in a custom command or whatever. So yeah, for the code stuff. And then like I mentioned, the workflow skills. And so for each of the workflow skills, each workflow skill in the way that we use it is associated with some sort of artifact. So like if you think about like there's a process, your internal process within your organization that you're trying to get AI to help you manage in some way. There's usually like an artifact associated with it. And so like this is like the template for the artifacts. So each of these workflows has like some sort of template associated with it for that artifact that captures that particular instance of that workflow. And then it saves it in this activity folder. So in our activity folder, like when we have bugs that we file, we have like the analysis of those bugs and stuff in here for any change sets that we do, any releases, like any research projects. So like here are some research projects that we've been doing recently. The skills are where the bulk of the knowledge is, like I mentioned, and agents and commands should be pretty thin. So like commands, like I think they should be just like 20 lines or less, because really it's just UI. Like it's just helping the user to, in a very simple way, utilize one or more skills together. So we have like a couple commands that we do, but all of these are very short and small, just focusing on the user interface and kind of connecting person to skills and or agents. And then typically for agents, you have it associated like the different types of roles. And so an agent, because it's a runtime efficiency thing, an agent is associated with one or more skills, one or more tools, and it sort of has like a particular type of task that it's responsible for. I did an example of where I did the command, the /bug command, and I just pasted it in a URL for one of our Sentry bugs. And so it right off the bat kicks off the support engineer subagent, which makes sense because it's obviously trying to debug something. And you could see that it uses the Sentry skill because it needs to know how to connect to Sentry and to actually get that information. It also does use the tech lead skill to do research into the code itself to find what is causing this bug. And then it generates the artifact that has this root cause. So like it basically did everything. And was able to find what the root cause is. Like I validated that this is actually correct. Like it did all the right things. And then if you want to implement this fix and you say yes, then it'll change workflows to start using the change set workflow and kind of go from there to actually start implementing a change.
Exceedingly impressive, that you've gotten to this point. So I have to say that first. I'm curious as you dig into the skills, and I think the answer is going to be because engineers are already at the command line with Claude Code anyway, versus building that library, like the Sentry one, for example, or the bug one. Why not have it in the Claude app? Or why, how do you sort of imagine the skills across all the surface area of Claude? How reusable are they if they're sort of just in the code base?
There's a mix between things that are generic, which is so generic skill is just understanding at a general level how to utilize a particular API, utilize a particular CLI, how to do things in a general sense, because anybody who uses Sentry would be able to utilize that same general skill. But then there's specifics, for us, just as an example, where does the environment variables that you need to plug into that API call are in a particular place for us that's unique to us, right? And so that's actually something that's part of that, as well as the details of how in Sentry we might have certain things set up that are different than other, I might some of the things I started putting that are custom that are part of that skill is okay, make sure you ignore these things because I just know in our system that these types of things happen from time to time, and don't get confused by that, whatever. So it's this mix of like general stuff and specific stuff. And that's where, like, to be honest, I, again, don't think this is like where this is just like a new, somewhat immature setup of things that I don't think there's the best way of handling that right now. Like the way that I'm doing it is I'm taking for the initial setup a generic version of a particular skill, like, and then I'm customizing it on top of it. So I'm adding my own custom things. In an ideal case, there would be some way of having those as like separate things that, like, because let's say just sticking with the Sentry thing, Sentry themselves should, in theory, publish a skill of some sort.
Sure.
Right.
That Claude can use. Yeah.
Yeah. And they should keep that up to date. And it should be just like you do with any other NPM dependency and whatever. And then you add your custom stuff as like kind of a separate thing on top of that.
I had a question about the journey to get here. Was this a one shot where you or somebody else was like, let's figure out the way to maximize the use of skills and agents and to, orchestrate that and get it right? Or was it a, mini, slow or smaller step progression, and what might that have looked like?
I think that I had a general sense of what I wanted to do right from the start, based off of like readings and other things that I've looked at. But really, the more that, like you guys I'm sure have seen, when you're actually using different things, then you see where, oh, this works well or this doesn't work well, and you have to kind of continuously update it. The thing I would say is that I want things to be highly structured. I want to be structured in a way that I understand, right? So maybe that structure will change, maybe, the details of that and whatever, but like I want to be on top of a system that I continuously think about and refine and figure out how to best structure this, and then set up the mechanisms of getting all of your team using it. So like it does help. The more people use it for the more things, the better you'll be able to start that flywheel of improvement, right?
Could you talk a little bit about the sort of rollout and onboarding and how that went? Because I'm sure there were folks who were more involved in sort of doing the experimenting and figuring out, what worked and what didn't. And then, there's a larger group that you've got to get on board and also help them understand the experimentation process.
It was literally lock people in a room for us. Like we went on a retreat, and just told everybody to bring their laptops and just booked the whole day. And we're like, okay, this is what we're going to do. Like, okay, these are the things that we've set up. Like, okay. And we looked at what, okay, what's the tasks that you have for the next, week that maybe are or not covered by this, go through some examples, whatever else. So it was I guess I had a heavy-handed approach that might not work in all environments. So I don't know, for a non-heavy-handed approach, like, yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that a little bit more.
Jeff, I'm familiar by name with things like Kilo and Ralph. I'm not familiar with, and I have no experience with those tools, but my understanding is that they have some opinions on how all this stuff gets set up and orchestrated long term. I'm curious if part of your effort was look at what's out there, like Kilo has templates for doing stuff. Did you look at that world, or are you sort of like waiting that out?
There isn't something that does exactly what I'm trying to do, but like the most common things I found is like on one side for like the Claude bot type thing is that they try to set things up so it's hands off, so that, minimal, again, I mentioned that you don't actually, it's black box. You don't like understand the structure, whatever else. It's like, it's done all for you. And so not just call about or OpenClaw, whatever, like there's a bunch of other systems that are very similar to that I've seen, that like they try to have this kind of passive approach to AI improving and getting better. And I think there's some validity in some of those, and maybe it's not all or nothing. Like maybe some parts of those actually should be implemented as part of your system. But and then the other thing that I've seen a lot is just like sort of like static context files being shared. So like just a Git repo with like, oh, here's my 20 skills, or like here's my main, Claude.md to like use that's like amazing or whatever. And yeah, so I've looked at a whole bunch of those, and like those are good to some degree or whatever, but like those are not specific to your organization, number one, and almost certainly not optimized for what you need to do. So like I think it's good to take learnings from those and maybe use as starters in some cases or whatever. But like the thing that I'm advocating for is that the most efficient way you're going to utilize AI is if you do make it very specific for your current environment, your current processes, et cetera.
Which I think makes sense for where we are in the journey of these tools in general. I think it's a little early to make a big bet on one of these platforms. I mean, Claude, obviously a safe bet, but like the Kilos and the Ralphs are pretty nascent.
Any thoughts on using different frontier models in the same code base? So using Opus versus, I think they're mean like switching between different models. Yeah, sure. What do you guys think about that?
My experience is limited there. I certainly have team members who will test the limits of various models for different cases and then, talk about them in Slack with the team and people will compare notes. But, that it also changes, release to release. So it's certainly a challenge to try and figure out what's the best to use for any given situation.
Yeah, we're still experimenting with different models. We use Codex for some things. We use Claude for most things that we're doing with AI. Personally, I found Codex to be getting better and better with 5.4 now or 5.2, whatever it is. I think the consistency is helpful. Sometimes I'll use Claude to check GPT's work and vice versa, and I find that's a pretty fair way to use multiple models and see what they each can do. But I think my team in general has mostly landed on Claude and staying focused with the Opus models.
The thing where I'm going from here, just so you guys know, is that I do want to, like, this is the sort of brainstorming part of my journey with this, of like, I'm trying things out. I want to talk to you guys about it. Love to hear, for anybody watching, comment below on like questions you have or things that you guys do out there that are different than what we talked about today. But what I want to get to is having part of this is not a codified thing. It's more of like a mental model thing. So like I'm going to, whether it's a presentation or like I have a more refined video to kind of like really some of the conceptual stuff I want to refine and get out there. But then for helping people to do some of these, I mean, just like I talked about, it's not as simple as having, like some people have done, having like, here's my GitHub repo of 50 skills, just copy these. Like, no. It's a process of how you actually go about creating these yourselves and integrating them into your organization. And so like, I think there is a way of getting AI to help guide you doing that. And so that's what I'm going to be working towards.